Dobrý podvečer tady v České republice a dobré odpoledne pro ty, kteří nás sledují z amerického kontinentu. A ráda bych přivítala všechny na dnešní akci na vzácné možnosti rozhovoru s Helenou Epsteinovou. Vítám všechny, ať už tady, co jsou osobně, tak ty, kteří jsou s námi virtuálně. A ráda bych uvedla, že toto video dále bude pokračovat v angličtině, nicméně později bude otitulkované, takže bude mít i české titulky. So now I will switch to English. Welcome also to everybody who is with us and who speaks English. Welcome everybody here in the Czech Republic as well in America or elsewhere. We are here today because of this book, Francina válka, and it's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce Helen Epstein, the editor and the daughter of the author of this memoir. So, Helen, welcome. It's great to see you. And I would like to start with a short bio. Helena Epsteinová was born in November 1947 here in Prague. Her parents lived in the Koruna building on Václavské náměstí. Her father, Kurt Epstein, was from Roudnice nad Labem. He was a champion swimmer. He represented Czechoslovakia in Olympic water polo. Her mother, Franci Epsteinová von Rabínková, was a dressmaker and dress designer. She ran Salon Weigand at 53 Spálina, meaning in this very same building where in these days is a bookshop. The Epsteins emigrated in the summer of 1948 by airplane to New York City. Helen was 8 months old. Her father knew no English, so for the first few years she heard only Czech at home. There were many famous Czech exiles in New York City at the time. Two of them, Milena Herbenová, wife of Ivan Herben, and Mimi Kohoutová, wife of Jarda Kohout, became employees of Francis. The famous soprano Jarmila Novotná was her first dress client in New York City. Dr. Karel Steinbach, whose life and achievements are known to many thanks to the biography of Viktor Fischl called Svědek téměř století. So Dr. Karel Steinbach was her doctor. Helen, the daughter, became a journalist in August of 1968 during the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact armies led by the Soviets. It was a coincidence that she visited her birthplace for the first time precisely in that month and year. Her article about her experience from Prague was published in the Jerusalem Post. Since that time, she has written articles, reviews, and a dozen books. I would like to use this opportunity to say how important the works of Helen were for me. My name is Kateřina Čapková. I'm a historian from the Institute of Contemporary History. And I first read her Children of Holocaust in early 90s when I became interested in Jewish history during my studies at the Charles University. And this book was eye-opening for me as for many others. The works of Helen accompanied me throughout my career as historian, and I felt so honored to meet her at one point in person, and I appreciate our friendship enormously. when Helen wrote to me at the beginning of 2019 about the memoir of her mother, I remember how excited I was about this project. I knew Francie from Helen's book, Where She Came From, and I was so much looking forward to learning more about her wartime experience. And when Helen sent me the manuscript, my excitement grew. Despite the fact that I have read so many other Holocaust memoirs by that time, Francie's war is exceptional. So thank you so much, Helen, to uh, be with us and to tell us more about these memoirs. Welcome.
Thank you, Katka. So, are we okay? You see me? All the way from Boston. So, as you remember, I wrote to you because I had been contacted by a stranger in Berlin by email. I received an email from someone in Berlin who said that he didn't believe something that I had written in Where She Came From, which in Czech is called Nalezená minulost. He said that he was the son of the first husband of the woman whom my mother said she had been in Pankratz prison with in 1939. So I thought this was unusual. I looked at my mother's manuscript and I saw that there were 2 pages or 3 pages about her experience with Marianne Goltz, the woman who the man in Berlin said was his father's first wife. And I scanned those pages and I sent them to him. And he agreed that this was, in fact, historical source material, and I was probably right, but he had never heard about this before. Marianne Goltz had been executed, her head had been chopped off by guillotine in Pankratz in 1943, and he was unaware that she had been there before in 1939. This is one of the many things that happens with the internet these days, that you're able to make contact. This incident for me resulted in my rereading my mother's manuscript, which I had not looked at for 20 years, pretty much. And as I looked through it and as I read it, I thought, this is an incredible historical resource for several reasons. First of all, it's very Czech. Secondly, it's in excellent English, so it can reach an English-speaking audience. And thirdly, it deals completely with a women's perspective on what happened during the Second World War. And because my mother was a dress designer, it gives you tremendous amount of detail. So that's when I sent it to you, Katka.
Thank you so much. So Helen, this interview should have been in person. Unfortunately, because of COVID, you were not able to come. Still, I remember your previous visit to Prague, during which the Stolpersteine in front of this bookshop were put. And there was another discussion with you. When you first went into this bookshop, which is in the same house where your mother had this dressmaker salon, what were your feelings? And had your mother some memoirs of this building, which she shared with you?
Yes. First of all, I love bookshops, and I love antiquariats, which we have fewer and fewer of in the United States. So I would have gone into that bookshop anyway. But the fact that it's in the house where my mother grew up and where my grandmother ran her business is very, very moving to me. My mother talked a lot about that building. She was a little girl here, and her cousin, Kitty Egererova, or then she was Kitty Volodiskova, lived on the same block. And the two of them used to play in the Rabinek apartment. And one of their games was to take flower pots and throw them down on the sidewalk on Spalina. And the police came, and so she told me about that because actually, when I lived in Manhattan, my brother, and we lived on the 10th floor, my brother also to take not flower pots, but water bottles and throw them down on the avenue below. And the police also came. So there might have been some genetic inheritance there. But also, and she writes in Francis War, that when she was in Pankratz for 2 weeks in 1939, Marianne Goltz told her that as soon as she got out of prison, they had to leave the center of Prague and move to a very, very small apartment where the Germans could not put in any more Jews with them. And so I learned a lot about what it was like to live in a big apartment in the center of Prague. My mother also told me that the Salon Weidart, and the Rabinek apartment were adjoining. So you could walk from one to the other. So it was a very, very large apartment. And you can see advertisements for Salon Weigart in some of the magazines of the time, of the 1920s and 1930s.
We mentioned that your first visit to Prague was in August 1968. So how did you like Prague? Did it fit into your expectations, because you have learned so much from your mother and father about Prague? And have you visited the places connected with your family at that time already, in the Václavské náměstí or here in Spalina?
Yes, well, when I came to Prague the first time in August of 1968, my mother's cousin Kitty was still alive. And Kitty was her best friend from childhood, but also Kitty went through the war with her from Terezin to Auschwitz, to Hamburg, to Bergen-Belsen, and back to Prague. And Kitty was still alive, and she brought me to Spalina Ulice, and I have pictures of the building from 1968 that I took because she wanted to show me where and my mother had thrown the flower pots down from, and where the police had come. And at that time, she also showed me the Korana building, and she showed me where my parents lived. But at that time, I didn't have time to go to Rodnice or to Kolín because the Russians came. And if you remember, the American ambassador at the time was Shirley Temple, the Hollywood star, and she organized an evacuation train. There was also an international geologists conference in Prague at the time. And so the invasion was on Wednesday morning, and on Friday morning, I was on a train being evacuated with 3,000 geologists to Paris. Train.
Thank you so much.
Incredibly, the whole thing. My arrival in Prague for the first time, my meeting Kitty and my cousin Nikki, who was then still alive, and the invasion was one of the most emotional events of my life. And of course, I wrote about it, and it was the first time I was published as a journalist. I sent what I wrote to the New York Times and the Jerusalem Post, and the Jerusalem Post printed it immediately, and that began my career as a journalist. I was a student in Israel at the time.
Thank you so much. So now I would like to focus on the memoirs. So they were written in the middle of 1970s. So were they offered to a publishing house at that time, or why were they not published in these years?
I think there were many reasons for that. First of all, uh, for American Jews, my mother was not a typical or even a model Jew. She was not religious. She was baptized as a Catholic when she was born. Her father was baptized because he had applied to university in Heidelberg and he was rejected. He thought because they had a numerus clausus that they would only take a certain number of Jews. So he had himself baptized, like Gustav Mahler had himself baptized when he wanted to be the director of the Vienna Opera. And he reapplied to university and he was accepted at Jena. He was an electrical engineer. And so uh, I forgot now what question I'm answering. My mother,
Why
why
were they not published in the
so
70s? Yeah?
she wasn't a typical Jew. She wasn't what Americans thought of as a Holocaust survivor. And I think in general, American Jews don't think about Czech Jews as typical Jews. You remember what happened with Madeleine Albright when Madeleine Albright said that she had just discovered she was Jewish. No Jewish person in America believed her because American Jews don't believe the degree of assimilation that Czech Jews had before the war and even after the war. So that was one reason that my mother wasn't typical. Secondly, in 1974, 1975, almost everything in America was still run by men. There were very few women in publishing. There were very few women anywhere in medical schools, in law schools, in business. Anywhere you looked, the number of women was very small. And even though women represented a huge number of readers, the number of memoirs by women were very small. And memoir as a genre was also not yet as popular as it has become now. All these reasons. Also, my mother was not a literary person. Although she spoke and wrote four languages very well, she was not, she was a dressmaker. She wasn't a writer, and she had no aspirations to be a writer. One of her clients in the United States was a literary agent, and that woman, that literary agent, sent it to many publishers, at least 20 publishers, and they all rejected it. The last reason I think maybe it was rejected was because my mother was extremely ahead of her time. And as a dressmaker, like hairdressers, she knew a lot of intimate details about her clients' lives, and she was very comfortable discussing many aspects of emotional life, sexual life, intimate life, heterosexuality, homosexuality, pretty much everything. And she writes about that in her memoir, and I think the publishers in 1974 were not ready to hear it.
It's actually one of the points I wanted to discuss because it's really unbelievable how open she writes about sexuality, sexual abuse, about gay and lesbian relations. And if I imagine that it was in the 70s when it was only gradually that some of the American states in the US started to decriminalize homosexuality. So it was really an enormously progressive text.
Right. I mean, even today, look at what's going on next door in Poland with gay rights. I mean, my mother was really, really ahead of her time. But I think, you as a historian know this. I think Prague in the 1920s was very progressive, 1920s, 1930s. And there was a gay community in Prague, and gay people were very much integrated into society. Maybe they didn't talk about it as frankly as my mother did, but my grandmother and my mother would have very, very close relationships with many different women clients. And as you try on dresses or when you get your hair styled, you talk to your to the person who is fitting you and who's taking care of you. So they heard a lot of this stuff in the 30s.
Very soon in the book, the reader finds a powerful story of Francis' father, who is, due to Francis, not able to commit suicide. Even though there are so many more fascinating stories in the book, this one comes to my mind immediately when somebody is speaking about this book. Did you know about this story before you read the manuscript?
Yes, actually, I knew all the stories before I read the manuscript because my mother, unlike many other survivors, was a woman who talked about her war experiences. And I think sometimes that she talked too much to me about her war experiences. But by the time I was a teenager, I knew everything that was in the book. The story of the suicide is very, very powerful, and it affected me very deeply because my mother, after the war, was very suicidal. She would lock herself up in our bathroom in New York City, and she would say she wanted to die. And she went into psychotherapy, and it helped a little bit, but she always was suicidal. So, what is the story of the suicide? When my grandfather finally understood what Nazism was, because it took him a very long time to understand what Nazism was. He was very German oriented. He had an Iron Cross from the First World War, and he belonged to the German casino in Prague, and he was very much a Germanophile. When he finally understood what Nazism was, he said, "They'll never get me. I will commit suicide. I have pills." What happened, though, was after my mother and grandparents were arrested and were in Pankratz in June of 1939, my mother came home and she went through her father's desk because she was concerned about the Gestapo finding lists or names of people who they could get into trouble because my mother had been in Pankratz. And instead of finding a list, she found some pills. And she was very suspicious because her parents, both my grandparents, were both suicidal. And she took these pills to a pharmacy, and the pharmacist told her they were cyanide pills. And so in 1939, she asked the pharmacist to replace the cyanide pills with saccharin pills. And then she replaced the bottle in the desk. So 3 years later, in Terezin, my mother and my two grandparents were deported, and they're sitting in Terezin at the entrance. And my mother is allowed to stay, and my grandparents are deported to the east. And my grandfather, according to the story my mother tells, stands up and says, I'm going to kill myself right now. I have pills. And he pulls out this vial of pills from his pocket. And my mother tells him, I replaced the pills with saccharin. They won't work. And for me, as the grandchild of these people, this was one of the most horrible stories I had ever heard anywhere. And it is an extremely powerful story. I was interviewed about family myths and family stories once, a long time ago, for a friend's book. And I told this story. And my friend told me that when I told this story, I turned completely white. And this was when I was in my 20s. So, yeah, I knew this very well.
What I found fascinating was how Franzi had in Terezin or Theresienstadt and but also in Auschwitz-Birkenau such a dense network of friends and contacts, and therefore her memoirs offer a unique testimony of a quite privileged experience. We learn many inside info about the leadership in Theresienstadt and also later in the family camp, so-called family camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So how do you explain that she was so successful in having such contacts, even if she was not Zionist, she was young. So it was an extremely interesting reading for me also, because other testimonies do not offer such an insight perspective.
Hmm. I think maybe this is one of the themes I think I run up against when I do my research. I find that historians rely so much on institutional and archival sources, and they don't really value or privilege memoirs. And I think personal memoirs are really, really, really important for this reason. Now, why was my mother in this position? I don't think it was a structural reason. I think it was what she describes. She was from Prague, and the core of the the privileged people in Terezin were really from Prague. It's true that the institutional leadership could be from the Zionists or from the Jewish community, but in fact, the people who had contacts on a daily level with other people were these young Prague Jews. Now, being young was a tremendous advantage for many reasons. One advantage, of course, was health. If you're young, most of the time you're healthy. The second reason that she told me was she was married. She was married to a young man, and the young man, Pepik Solar, had just finished the Czech army. And so he had many, many contacts with Czechs who were not Jews and who were outside Terezin. And I'm sure you know from your own research that there was tremendous back and forth from Terezin to Prague. There was smuggling of mail, there was smuggling of food, and that was because all of these young men and women who were Czech Jews had friends outside who were not Jews. And they had much more contact with the outside world than non-Czech Jews had. So that was one thing. The second thing was that because she was a businesswoman and because she had a large clientele in Prague and because her mother had a clientele in Prague, she knew a lot of people, a lot of women. So when, for example, she was sent to Terezin, the woman in her in the bunk above her had been a customer of her mother. Many people had knew about her mother or knew about her or knew about her husband or were friends of Kitty's. So she had a core group of people who each knew about 100 people. So she had all of this. On top of all of that, she had a very important skill. She could sew and she could cut. So what she did immediately was she started making things for other people and sewing skirts, sewing blouses, sewing blankets, repairing clothes. And through that, she also met an awful lot of people. So also, I shouldn't forget Vava. She had another cousin in Terezin who was Vava Shernova, who wrote the memoir Chtěla jsem být herečka. And Vava knew a lot of people. And Vava had an affair with one of the Jewish rabbis who later was one of the people in charge of running Terezin. So she was connected in many ways to a lot of people for all these reasons.
It seems to me that as if the most important books of yours are related to each other, and all of them are somehow connected with your family. It starts with your world-famous Children of Holocaust, where you write about the transmission of the trauma experience, but also of hope and resistance to the second generation of Holocaust. But your book, Where She Came From, is about your mother and the Czech Jewish history. Your taboo-breaking book, The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma, is about love and sex in the post-Holocaust context. So is the publication of your mother's memoirs, in a sense, a final word to this daughter-mother relation?
Yes, I hope so. I've noticed that, particularly among Czech women, the dyad of mother and daughter is very, very strong. Um, I don't know if that's true everywhere, but I've noticed it particularly among Czech women, particularly when I was growing up in New York City, that the mother daughter relationship was incredibly strong. And it's true that if you look at world literature, very often sons write about their fathers and about their father's history. I mean, Tolstoy wrote about his father's history. And of course, Turgenev wrote Fathers and Sons. And the literature of mothers and daughters is, of course, much smaller because there's so many fewer women writers. But I think eventually, and certainly now, there are many, many, many women writers who have been very much affected by their mother's history and have written about it. I hope that I'm done because I'm 73 years old and I would like to write more about my own life and my own experiences. I also worked as an arts journalist all these years. So while this is not as well known, I have written about, for example, musicians such as Vladimir Horowitz and Leonard Bernstein and Yo-Yo Ma. And I've also written about theater people. I wrote a biography of a famous American theater producer who, in fact, produced Havel for the first time in New York City in the 60s. His name was Joseph Papp, and I wrote a biography of him. So I have done other things besides these Holocaust books, but it is true that's what I have been known for. And actually, when I started writing Children of the Holocaust, my mother warned me not to do it because she said that I would be labeled for the rest of my life by this book. And she was right.
But at the same time, you are preparing now an exhibition about your father in Roudnice nad Labem.
Right.
So it might mean that you plan now to deal with your father's history as well.
No, I don't think so. I think my father was very much neglected in my family for many reasons. First of all, he didn't speak much English. So when I was a child, I spoke with him a lot in Czech. But by the time I was a teenager, I had switched to English, and we really couldn't speak very much about the things that mattered to me because he didn't have the vocabulary in English. And I have two younger brothers, and my brothers also found it quite difficult to speak with him because he really couldn't speak very well. It's really a very difficult immigrant experience that you can't speak with your children. So that was one thing. The second thing is that my father's family was completely unlike my mother's family. My mother's family was very dramatic, very intense, had lots of psychological problems. They all wanted to commit suicide. My great-grandmother did commit suicide. She threw herself out of a window in Vienna in 1891. I write about that in Where She Came From. And my father's family, in comparison, was incredibly boring. The Epsteins came to Roudnice, we think, at the end of the 18th century. There are several generations of Epsteins in the Roudnice cemetery. My grandfather, was the president of his synagogue in Roudnice. He hired Rabbi Richard Feder. Richard Feder gave my father his bar mitzvah in 1917. And the family just stayed in this same little town of Roudnice nad Labem all these years. And actually, their house, which is now the Podzipsky Museum, is where the exhibit will be. I think it opens in the middle of July. And it really documents this incredibly stable, healthy family. The only thing that wasn't healthy in this family, the only thing that was unusual, two things were unusual. The first thing was that my father became a swimmer and he became a water polo champion, and he was on the Czechoslovak Olympic Committee after the war, so from 45 to 48. The second thing that was unusual about the Epstein family was that his younger brother was intellectually disabled. It was never clear whether he was genetically disabled or whether he had been brain damaged at birth. I tend to think he was genetically disabled. But those were the two unusual things about the Epsteins. But otherwise, they were a completely unremarkable family. They did very well. My grandfather started a leather factory in Rodnice. They were prosperous, but they were not interesting to write about. And the other issue is that I am not particularly interested in sports. The sports genes in my family went to my two brothers, who are both avid skiers and tennis players and very active. And I got my mother's genes and became much more of an intellectual, I guess. And so I don't think I'm going to write another book about my father because I know almost everything there is to know. I should also say my father did not talk about the war as much as my mother. I know that what's interesting about my father's experience was that he survived with two other men pretty much the whole time. One of them was the famous conductor Karel Ančer, the late conductor. And it was always very funny to us because my father was not very musical. Because he was the son of a factory owner, he was given violin lessons, but he really couldn't care less about music. He was really a sports person. And here he was the whole war with this conductor of the Czech Philharmonic. And so the two of them used to give each other lessons. My father would talk to Karel about sports, and Karel would talk to my father about music. And there was a third man, but I don't remember his name. We can't find his name. And he was a businessman. But these three guys together survived the war. And that's the most colorful thing I remember about what my father told me. And also one other thing, that at selection at Auschwitz, they had to, before they had the two lines, they had three lines. And my father stepped into one line, and at the very last minute, he moved into the line with his two friends, and that saved his life. Those are the two stories that he told. So you can tell they're interesting, but they're not as dramatic as my mother's stories. And he hardly ever talked about sex. The only thing I know about my father, and I would love to know more, but it's very hard to find this information. I know that for 12 years he had a love affair with a married woman. And I know that my Epstein grandparents liked her very much and welcomed her into their home, which I find really unusual in the 1920s and 1930s. And the only reason that they couldn't get married was because her husband refused to give this woman a divorce. And I think her name was Mila, but that's all I know. And she died in the war. She was murdered in the war.
If I may, there is a coincidence that only 3 days ago I was in the Czech radio speaking about Karel Ančer, because a journalist from the Czech radio discovered memoirs, like spoken memoirs of Karel Ančer in the Toronto archive. Because after '68 he emigrated to Toronto.
Right.
So it's another coincidence that's now 3 days after we spoke about it in the radio, I hear about the experience of your father. So that's really amazing. Karel Ančer. Otherwise, he lost his wife and a small child in Auschwitz, and the child was born in Terezin. Actually, when I was rereading your the memoirs of your mother yesterday, it is a coincidence that when she writes about her first birthday in Terezin in February 43, it's exactly the month when Anchels have the baby in Terezin. So it's another coincidence. So
Yes.
yeah.
He stopped in New York in '68 when he was going to Toronto, and I remember meeting him.
So you have met Carl Anchel in New York?
New York, yes, in '68. So I was 20, so it was another Czech refugee. I grew up with many Czech refugees, so it was another Czech refugee who was very famous in Czechoslovakia, but nobody knew who he was in New York. So
thank you so much. If you want to add something, please let me know. Would you like to add something to what we have? Have I forgotten something to ask?
I think everything is good. I wonder whether anybody who is listening or anyone in the bookstore has a question.
I'm just glad to see you and hear you. Very, very great.
Do you hear? They are only saying that they are very glad to see you and hear you. So thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you so much. It was fascinating, and we recommend everybody to read the memoirs, and you can buy it here in this bookshop or elsewhere. And thank you so much, Helen, again.
And thank you to everybody at Spalena 53. And I hope to see you in person sometime soon when the pandemic is over.
Sure. I hope you will be able to come to Prague soon. That will be great.
We hope so.
Too.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.